Page 407. And may my compassionate reader now have mercy on me. Until now, my pen sped on untrembling. My heart didn't skip a beat, and we slipped along unconcerned, because for these 15 years, we have been firmly protected either by legal revolutionality or else by revolutionary legality. But from now on, things will be painful, as the reader will recollect, as we have explained to us dozens of times. We have had explained to us dozens of times, beginning with Khrushchev. Quote, from approximately 1934, violations of Leninist norms of legality began, unquote. And how are we to enter this abyss of illegality now? How are we to drag our way along yet another bitter stretch of the road? However, these trials which follow were, because of the frame of the defendants, a cynosure for the whole world. They did not escape the attention of the public. They were written about, they were interpreted, and they will be interpreted again and again. It is for us merely to touch lightly on their riddle. Let us make one qualification, though not a big one. The published stenographic records did not coincide completely with what was said at the trials. One writer who received an entrance pass, they were given out only to selected individuals, took running notes, and subsequently discovered these differences. All the correspondents also noted the snag with Kretinsky, which made a recess necessary in order to get him back on the track of his assigned testimony. Here is how I picture it. Before the trial, a chart was set up for emergencies. In the first column was the name of the defendant. In the second, the method to be used during the recess if he should depart from his text during the open trial. In the third column, the name of the checist responsible for applying the indicated method. So Krestinsky departed from his text, then who would come on the run and what that person would do had already been arranged. But the inaccuracies of the stenographic record do not change or lighten the picture. Dumbfounded, the world watched 3 plays in a row, 3 wide-ranging and expensive dramatic productions in which the powerful leaders of the fearless Communist Party, who had turned the entire world upside down and terrified it, now marched forth like doleful, obedient goats and bleated out everything they had been ordered to, vomited all over themselves, cringingly abased themselves in their convictions, and confessed to crimes they could not in any wise have committed. This was unprecedented in remembered history. It was particularly astonishing in contrast with the recent Leipzig trial of Dimitrov. Dimitrov had answered the Nazi judges like a roaring lion, and immediately afterward, his comrades in Moscow, members of that same unyielding cohort which had made the whole world tremble, and the greatest of them at that, who had been called the Leninist Guard, came before the judges drenched in their own urine. And even though much appears to have been clarified since then, with particular success by Arthur Koestler, the riddle continues to circulate as cheerfully as ever. People have speculated about a Tibetan potion that deprives a man of his will, and about the use of hypnosis. Such explanations must by no means be rejected. If the NKVD possessed such methods, clearly there were no moral rules to prevent resorting to them. Why not weaken or muddle the will? And it is a known fact that in the 20s, some leading hypnotists gave up their careers and entered the service of the GPU. It is also reliably known that in the 30s, a school for hypnotists exile existed in the NKVD. Ch.10's wife was allowed to visit her husband before his trial and found him not himself, his reactions retarded, and she managed to communicate this to others before she herself was arrested. But why was neither Polchinski nor Kranikov broken by the Tibetan potion or hypnosis? Fact is that an explanation on a higher psychological plane is called for. One misunderstanding in particular results from the image of these men as old revolutionaries who had not trembled in Tsarist dungeons, seasoned, tried and true, hardened, etc., fighters. But there is a plain and simple mistake here. These defendants were not those old revolutionaries. They had acquired that glory by inheritance from an association with the neurotics, the socialist revolutionaries, and the anarchists. They were the ones, the bomb throwers and the conspirators, who had known hard labor, imprisonment and real prison terms. But then they had never in their lives experienced the genuinely merciless interrogation, because such a thing did not exist at all in Tsarist Russia. And these others, the Bolshevik defendants at the treason trials, had never known either interrogation or real prison terms. The Bolsheviks had never been sentenced to special dungeons, any special hard labor in Yakutsk. It is well known that Dzerzhinsky had the hardest time of them all, that he had spent all his life in prison, but according to our yardstick, he had served just a normal tenor, just a simple 10-ruble bill, like any ordinary collective farmer in our time. True, included in that tenor were 3 years in a hard labor central prison, but that is nothing special either. The party leaders who were the defendants in the trial of 1936 to 38 had, in their revolutionary past, known short, easy imprisonment, short periods of exile, and had never had a whiff of hard labor. Bukharin had many petty arrests on his record, but they amounted to nothing. Apparently he was never imprisoned anywhere for a whole year at a time, and he was just a wee bit of exile on Omega. Kamenev, despite long years of propaganda work and travel to all the cities of Russia, spent only 2 years in prison and 1.5 years in exile. In our time, even 16-year-old kids got 5 right off. Zinoviev, believe it or not, never spent as much as 3 months in prison. He never received even one sentence. In comparison with the ordinary natives of our archipelago, they were all callow youths, and they didn't know what prison was like. Rykov and Smirnov had been arrested several times and had been imprisoned for 5 years, but somehow they went through prison very easily, and they either escaped from exile without any trouble at all, or were released because of an amnesty, until they were arrested and imprisoned in the Lubyanka. They hadn't the slightest idea what a real prison was, nor what the jaws of an unjust interrogation were like. There's no basis for assuming that if Trotsky had fallen into those jaws, he would have conducted himself in any less self-abasement, or that his resistance would have proved stronger than theirs. He had had no occasion to prove it. He too has known only easy imprisonment, no serious interrogations, and a mere 2 years in exile in Ust-Kut. Terror Trotsky inspired as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council was something he acquired very cheaply, does not at all demonstrate any true strength of character or courage. Those who have condemned many others to be shot often wilt at the prospect of their own death. The two kinds of toughnesses are not connected. And as for Radek, he was a plain provocateur, and he wasn't the only one in these three trials. And Yagoda was an inveterate habitual criminal. This murderer of millions simply could not imagine that his superior murderer up top would not, at the last moment, stand up for him and protect him, just as though Stalin had been sitting there right in the hall. Yagoda confidently and insistently begged him directly for mercy. I appeal to you. For you, I build two great canals. And a witness reports that at just a moment, a match flared in the shadows behind a window on the second floor of the hall, apparently behind a muslin curtain, and while it lasted, the outline of a pipe could be seen. Whoever has been in Bakhchisari may remember that oriental trick. The second-floor windows in the hall sessions of the State Council are covered with iron sheets, pierced by small holes, and behind them is an unlit gallery. I wonder if that's what they mean by the Iron Curtain. When they say the Iron Curtain. Maybe it's more disturbing than we even think. It is never possible to guess down in the hall whether someone is up there or not. Khan remained invisible, and the council always met as if in his presence. Given Stalin's out-and-out oriental character, I can readily believe that he watched the comedies in that October hall. I cannot imagine that he would have denied himself this spectacle, this satisfaction. And after all, our entire failure to understand derives from our belief in the unusual nature of these people. We do not, after all, where ordinary confessions signed by ordinary civilians are concerned, find their reasons for denouncing themselves and others so fulsomely baffling. We accept it as something we understand. A human being is weak. A human being gives in. But we consider Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Pyatakov, Smirnov to be supermen to begin with, and in essence our failure to understand is due to that fact alone. True, the directors of this dramatic production seem to have had a harder task in selecting the performers than they'd had in earlier trials of the engineers. In those trials they had 40 barrels to pick from, so to speak, whereas here the available troupe was small. Everyone knew who the chief performers were, and the audience wanted to see them in the roles, and them only. Yet there was a choice. The most far-sighted and determined of those who were doomed did not allow themselves to be arrested. They committed suicide first. Skripnik, Tomsky, Gamernik, it was the ones who wanted to live who allowed themselves to be arrested, and one could certainly braid a rope from the ones who wanted to live. But even amongst them, some behaved differently during the interrogations, realized what was happening, turned stubborn, and died silently, but at least not shamefully. For some reason, they did not, after all, put on public trial. Rudsutak, Postushev, kids, Chubar, Kozier, and, for that matter, Krylenko himself, even though their names would have embellished the trials. They put on trial the most compliant. A selection was made after all. The men selected were drawn from a lower order. But, on the other hand, the mustached producer knew each of them very well. He also knew that on the whole they were weaklings, and he knew one by one the particular weaknesses of each. Therein he lay his dark and special talent. Therein lay his special talent, his main psychological bent and his life's achievement, to see people's weaknesses on the lowest plane of being. And the man who seems, in the perspective of time, to have embodied the highest and brightest intelligence of all the disgraced and executed leaders, and to whom Arthur Koestler apparently dedicated his talented inquiry, was Bukharin. Stalin saw through him too, at that lowest stratum at which the human being unites with the earth. And Stalin held him in a long death grip, playing with him as a cat plays with a mouse, letting him go just a little and then catching him again. Bukharin wrote every last word of our entire existing, in other words, non-existent constitution, which is so beautiful to listen to. And he flew up there, he flew about up there just below the clouds, and thought that he had outplayed Koba, that he had thrust a constitution on him that could compel him to relax the dictatorship, and at that very moment, he himself had already been caught in those jaws. Bukharin did not like Kamenev and Zinoviev. Way back when they had first been tried, after the murder of Kirov, he had said to people close to him, "Well, so what? That's the kind of people they were. Maybe there was something to it." That was the classic formula of the Philistine of those years. There was probably something to it. In our country, they don't arrest people for nothing. And that was said in 1935 by the leading theoretician of the party. He spent the period of the second trial of Kamenev and Zinoviev in the summer of 36, hunting down the teen Shan, and knew nothing about it. Hunting in the teen Shan and knew nothing about it. He came down from the mountains to Prunes, and there he read that the death sentence had been imposed on both men, and he read the newspaper articles which made it clear what annihilating testimony they had given against him. But did he hasten to stop the act of repression? Did he protest to the party that something monstrous was being done? No, all he did was send Koba a telegram asking him to postpone the execution of Kamenev and Zinoviev so that he, Bukharin, could get there to confront them and prove himself innocent. It was too late. Koba had enough of the sworn testimony. Why did he need living confrontations? However, they still didn't arrest Bukharin for a long time. He lost his job as editor-in-chief at Izvestia, and all his other party assignments and jobs. And he lived for half a year in his Kremlin apartment in the Poteshny Palace of Peter the Great, as if in prison. However, the autumn, he used to go get his dacha, and the Kremlin guards would salute him as though nothing at all had changed. No one visited him or phoned him any longer, and all during these months he wrote endless letters, "Dear Koba, dear Koba, dear Koba," and he got not one reply. He was still trying to establish friendly contact with Stalin, and dear Koba, squinting, was already staging rehearsals. For many long years Koba had been holding tryouts for various roles, and he knew that Bukharchik would play his part beautifully. He had, after all, already renounced all of his pupils and supporters who had been arrested and exiled. They were few in number in any case, and had allowed them to be destroyed. He had stood by and allowed his own line of thinking to be wiped out and pilloried before it was fully developed and born. and more recently, while he was still editor-in-chief of Izvestia and a member of the Politburo, he had accepted as legal the execution of Kamenev and Zinoviev. Neither at the top of his lungs nor even in a whisper had he expressed any indignation over that. And yet these had all been trials for his own future woe. Way back in the past, when Stalin had threatened to expel him and all the rest of them from the party, Bukharin, like all the rest, had renounced his views in order to remain in the party. And that too had been a trial for his woe. That was how they acted while still in freedom and still at the height of honor and power. Then they could certainly be depended on to follow the script and the play faultlessly with their body, their food, and their sleep were in the hands of the Lubyanka prompters. And what did Bukharin fear the most in those months before his arrest? It is reliably known that above all he feared expulsion from the party, being deprived of the party, being left alive but outside the party. And Dierkova had played magnificently on this trait of his, as he had with them all, from the very moment he had himself become the party. Like all the rest of them, did not have his own individual point of view. They didn't have their own genuine ideology of opposition, on the strength of which they could step aside and on which they could take their stand. Before they became an opposition, Stalin declared them to be one, and by this move he rendered them powerless, and all their efforts were directed towards staying in the party, and toward not harming the party at the same time. These added up to too many different obligations for them to be independent. In essence, Bukharin had been allotted the starring role, and nothing was to be overlooked or abridged in the producer's work with him, in working of time on him, and in his own getting used to the role. Even sending him to Europe the previous winter to acquire manuscripts by Marx had been essential, not just superficially, for the sake of the whole network of accusations about his establishing contacts, but so that the aimless freedom of life on tour might all the more insistently demand his return to the main stage. And now, beneath black thunder clouds of accusations came along in the interminable state of non-arrest, of exhausting housebound lethargy, which ground down the will power of the victim even more effectively than the direct pressure of the Lubyanka. Nor would the Lubyanka run away either. It too would last for a year. On one occasion, Bukharin was summoned by Kaganovich, who arranged a confrontation between him and Sokolnikov in the presence of high-ranking Chekists. Sokolnikov gave testimony about the parallel rightist center, parallel, in other words, to that of the Trotskyites, and about Bukharin's underground activity. Kaganovich conducted the interrogation aggressively and then ordered Sokolnikov to be taken away. And he said to Bukharin in a friendly tone, "He lies in his teeth, the whore." Despite that, the newspapers continued to report the indignation of the masses. Bukharin telephoned the Central Committee. Bukharin wrote letters beginning "Dear Koba," in which he begged that the accusations against him be publicly denied. And then the prosecutor's office published a roundabout declaration. Quote, "Objective proofs for the indictment of Bukharin have not been found." Unquote. Radek telephoned him in the fall, wanting to see him. Bukharin shunned him. "We are both being accused. Why add another cloud?" But their Isvestia country houses were next to each other, and Radek dropped in on him one evening. Quote, "No matter what I may say later on, please know that I am not to blame for anything. And anyway, you will come out of it whole. You are not connected with the Trotskyites," unquote. And Bukharin believed that he would come out of it whole and that he would not be expelled from the party, for that would be monstrous. In actuality, he had always been hostile to the Trotskyites. They had put themselves outside the party, and look what had come of it. They had to stick together. Even if they made mistakes, they had to stick together on that too. We'll take a break there. Thank you for listening. I apologize, I was a little tongue-tied today. It's been a long night. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you being here.